I'm Clemens Ortlepp, and super happy to be speaking today at Ending Age-Related Diseases Conference. Thanks so much for inviting us from the Molecule team to speak. I'm going to give a quick introduction to the intellectual property NFT that we've been working on throughout the last year. This will not be a very technical explanation, but more of a conceptual explanation of what it is, what we believe it will enable, and how this can support researchers in acquiring funding and working together on achieving their research goals. Let's jump quickly into an outline here. Let's see, here we go. So I'm going to give a quick introduction on myself and on Molecule, very brief, so that you know who is speaking and kind of the background of it. Then going to quickly recap what an NFT is. I don't expect that everyone here knows crypto and Web3 so well, so I just want to make sure that we start on from the same base layer. Then going to give you the download on the intellectual property NFT, or as we often call it, IP-NFT. Highlight how it enables research funding, and lastly highlight some further utilities that we see from that framework, the IP-NFT framework, arising. All right, let's start with the introduction. A couple notes to myself. Clemens Ortlepp, as said, backgrounds in business administration, product management, data analytics. I worked for a long time in fintech companies, and then pivoted around 2018 into Web3 and smart contract engineering. But personally, from a just personal interest note, I've been exploring the pharmaceutical development life cycle throughout a couple of years with friends. And in 2021, when I heard Molecule working at the intersection of Web3 and the research space, the medical research space, the bio research space, I got immediately intrigued and started working with them as a product manager. Now, a couple of words to Molecule. It's a platform that enables researchers to be funded and get their research projects funded by different entities, most formally known as Decentralized Autonomous Organizations, or DAOs, via cryptocurrencies. That does not necessarily just focus on longevity, but all kinds of different disease areas. But at the same time, Molecule also works on helping communities form in the Web3 or blockchain space, which are called DAOs, and help them get bootstrapped and collect funds to support the cause that they want to drive forward, and therefore enable more funds to find their way into the researchers' hands. Lastly, we're working also on the infrastructure side, meaning that we're building infrastructure like the IP-NFT to enable all of that to happen. Now, as I said, Molecule is also involved in launching those DAOs, those organizations that you could compare to associations, just that all of the voting and governance is happening transparently on chain on a distributed ledger that everybody can have a look at and see how decisions are made. And one of the first organizations that we helped launch is DAO, which you might have heard already of, because there's also some other speakers which have great topics to talk about throughout this weekend. And we're still in touch with them, helping them on their funding and IP-NFT needs. And next to DAO, we're also helping right now some other DAOs in other disease areas or other areas of interest to facilitate themselves, come together and work together on achieving a certain goal. Now, let's jump into the IP-NFT framework. And I'm calling it a framework because it is actually not necessarily a tech stack or something, but it's actually just a aggregation of different concepts that we put together and that can be implemented independent of the necessary tech stack. What we first need to understand for that is what is a non-fungible token. And those have gotten a lot of media attention, unfortunately not necessarily a good media attention because of unfortunate scams and stuff like that happening throughout the last year. But non-fungible tokens is an interesting technology to have a look at for creating scarcity in the digital realm. Now, scarcity, creating that in the digital realm, is a topic that has also been hotly debated because, in a way, the question is arising, do we want scarcity in a digital realm? But similar to, for example, the creation of knowledge, in some aspects, we want the creators to be protected when it comes to the creations that they're making. And so, for example, when we talk about patents, we currently in our societal and legal system agree that certain knowledge that is aggregated, generated, and use case being generated from that, which is patentable, we want to have certain people protected so that they can actually basically monetize their inventions. And similar in the digital realm, we could say, hey, people who are creating certain things, it could be artworks, but it could also, as said, be inventions, should be in a position to monetize their creations, even in the digital realm, to get back all those investments that they made. This is like a prelude to what actually like non-fungible tokens are. Now, for understanding non-fungible tokens, we need to understand non-fungibility and tokens. Let's start with the tokens, because that I think is pretty straightforward. Is basically an ownership relationship that is stored on the blockchain, which is just saying somebody owns a certain amount of something. Now, this token can be fungible or non-fungible. And fungibility is actually a spectrum. The most fungible goods are currencies, because we don't really care if I own €1 or another euro. I can interchange them, those 2 euros, and the value stays the same. You know, even if they're like dirty or doesn't matter who had them before, they will always have the same value. Now, on the other side of the fungibility spectrum are things which are completely unique, such as, for example, artworks that were created, such as, let's say, the Mona Lisa. That artwork that could be replicated, but we, as a social construct almost, agree together that the initial Mona Lisa is the artwork that we ascribe the most value to, because it was the first time somebody came up with that certain concept, that certain idea, and that skill set, obviously. Now, the same thing applies for patents. When we create a patent, it is actually non-fungible, because you can't exchange it for any other patent, and we ascribe it the individual value of the work that went into creating this knowledge and creating this invention. Now, for on-chain assets, it's really, really important for us to differentiate between those two, because they're being implemented in a very different manner. Now, for non-fungible tokens on blockchains, we can actually connect that to basically any kind of asset. You don't want to store a lot of information on the blockchain, but you can store a little bit. And what we're storing then there is a link to the asset that is managed with the blockchain. So if you think about it, for example, here on the right, you see OpenSea. A lot of people right now use that to store a link to a certain artwork that might be on a decentralized ledger, a decentralized data storage, so that if somebody like looks at the token on the smart contract ledger, they see the link to the artwork and know, okay, this artwork is owned by me. Even though it might, let's say, is accessible to more people, it's still the initial ownership defined by the smart contract, by the blockchain, stated that I'm the owner. Okay, so now we understand non-fungible tokens. Let's understand and jump into the IP-NFT, so the intellectual property NFT. And for that, we basically have to look at two things. And just remember here that this is a framework, and we're not talking about a certain technical implementation of this, but just the conceptual framework that can be implemented with different tools on different blockchains in different ways. So the two things that we look at are the legal contract and the smart contract. The legal contract is really important because we want our IP-NFT to be enforceable in certain jurisdictions. And the smart contract is important because we want to manage the ownership of the certain asset, let's say the legal contract or a data asset or a patent, to be managed via the blockchain. Why is that interesting? Because if we can manage it via the blockchain, we take a lot of transaction costs out of the equation. Normally, if you would transact around IP, you would transact around any legal contract, you would need to have involved lawyers, you would need to go through lengthy negotiations. But with a blockchain, we can actually create standards that enable us to very quickly and easily transact around such assets and use them also for certain, let's say, other use cases that arise within that ecosystem. And I will shed a light on that in a little bit. Now, let's return to the legal contract, because I think it is important to understand how those two things work together. The legal contract actually references the smart contract, and the smart contract references the legal contract, making sure that there's a bond which can't really be broken. So how does it work? The legal contract is actually two contracts. It's one contract, which is, it could be the sponsored research agreement, it could be a patent, it could be an agreement for future IP, or even a sales agreement for a data asset. And the second agreement is actually an agreement that is stating that the parties agree to transfer the ownership of the first agreement and the parties that are involved in that onto someone who is holding a certain token on-chain. So the second agreement basically states, hey, whoever holds a certain asset in a certain smart contract on the blockchain is the owner and the counterparty in the legal agreement that it's connected to. So you could even really think about it if you think about a PDF where you have normally the counterparties being identified by the name and the address and maybe further identifiers. In this case, the counterparties are identified by a smart contract address and by a token, and potentially even by address that is giving out that specific token, right? Okay, so now we captured how legal contracts reference the smart contract. Now, how does the smart contract reference the legal contract? And that is coming back to what is being connected on-chain into the smart contract. And I already referenced last time on the last slide that the for artworks, it's basically the artwork that is connected into this. In our case, we are connecting the legal contract into the smart contract, so that anybody who has the token basically, or knows of the token, can actually look, okay, what is the legal contract that is connected to it? Now, there's a bit of a caveat there, and that is there's two different use cases that we have here. Legal contracts which are private, and legal contracts which can be made public, because maybe there is a grant from government or something like this. So in the case where it's private, we actually have technologies to also make the access to the data that is connected to the token, connected on-chain, only accessible to people who actually own the token. And that now brings us into the modularity that we are currently working on bringing into IP-NFTs. Because you already hear there's already two use cases here just for storing that data, and there's a lot of different other use cases that we currently see in the DeSci ecosystem arising, where people have data that needs to be public, data that is being added later to the token, data that needs to be private, maybe data that can be partially private, partially public. And we're currently working on making this whole framework more modular, so those different use cases can be accustomed and can be actually accounted for, and we can pull in the modules that we need. And just to highlight a little bit here, the third asset, which actually comes into play when looking into intellectual property NFTs, is the data storage aspect. And that is, there might be connected to a sponsored research agreement, there might be the decision that, hey, we want to store the data that is connected to the sponsored research agreement that is arising from this research, accessible to the one who's funded it directly. And as the one who funded it could decide to at any point to sell the IP NFT to someone else, which is now the owner and therefore the owner of the data that is arising of it, that data needs to be accessible and potentially only accessible to the one owning the token on-chain. So this is one of the use cases that, for example, we have encountered in the last year that we are using data storages which only allow people who have the token to access the data. Now, that can be solved in different ways. It can be done with centralized data storages. Let's say a university has its own data storage where it stores that, or you're scared that, for example, a centralized entity could cut their servers, cut access to it, and then whatever is connected to the token on-chain actually is not available anymore. You want to store it, therefore, on a decentralized data storage network where it is being hosted by a whole network of people working together to make it accessible. Those are different, again, going different in the modularity, different aspects that we're currently working on, and the different ways of how those solutions could contribute to the intellectual property NFT framework. Okay, so just to recap, because this I think was a lot of information, we have the legal contract, which makes sure there is a enforceability in a jurisdiction that is referencing a smart contract, which the smart contract is also referencing the legal contract. And the smart contract is basically there to manage the ownership and the counterparties in the contract, and therefore makes it super easy to transfer. Another aspect and an upside that comes with it is that entities which are working on-chain, which I mentioned before, like the Decentralized Autonomous Organizations, the DAOs, can actually own those assets on-chain, because they might not actually have a bank account or an address yet, but they might be a loose form of people who are interested in a certain area and want to just fund certain research, and then they can actually own this asset on-chain and manage it via their DAO, which they would not be able if the IP-NFT wouldn't exist. And that's one of the major use cases actually for the DAOs of this framework. Now, the last part, as I stated, is an optional data storage unit, which is potentially adding additional information to the NFT that can be linked into it. Similar like the legal contract is linked into it via URLs. That's how you can envision it. It's just like a link to a data storage location that can be accessible. Now the data can be, again, optionally encrypted or publicly available, depending on the needs. And then there's other services which enable you to encrypt and decrypt, making sure that only people who own the token on chain actually get to see the information. But given that there's different use cases next to just funding research, maybe another one is just a, let's say, an agreement for researching a certain molecule in a lab, which is, something that, for example, LabDAO is working on with their network, is something where we believe this general framework can also help that, and is using basically certain components of this to make it work for them, while other components are not being looked at in that case. All right, now let's have a quick look how our use case of funding research works. And let's first focus here on the left side on the researchers, which are looking for funding, have a potentially a groundbreaking idea on something that they want to research, and they believe can contribute to our understanding. On the other side are entities that are coming from a, let's say, crypto native background, that are just interested in pooling resources, managing that transparently better than and less more frictionless than it would happen in a legal setup. They're doing this basically on-chain and transparent and way more efficient. Now, they pool those resources and they want to find a way to fund those researchers. Now, as they would like to have all their assets, all their resources on-chain, because that's also where their currencies are, we need to bridge the agreement on-chain, and that's where the IP-NFT basically comes into play. And that's what we're here in the middle with Molecule are doing. We're basically on-ramping the legal agreement, and we're helping them off-ramp the cryptocurrencies, which are now basically go to into the researchers' hands in form of euros or USDs, so they can spend it on their research needs and on the resources they need to conduct the research project. Now, we're just one of those providers, and we just developed this framework because we think it will be super beneficial for the whole ecosystem, but also other providers can actually jump in and generate those with the tech stack. And I think one of them, just to highlight again, is LabDAO, which is doing amazing work on enabling like researchers to work together and get labs to basically work together and have IP-NFTs or the need, for example, to transact around lab services also structured on-chain, and the payment for that happening on-chain as well. And that, I think, is just an extension of something similar where data is being aggregated on-chain, access is being managed on-chain, and then researchers can pay directly to those on-chain entities. All right. having looked at the how it enables research funding, I just want to recap one more time how Molecule basically would go about it. We would talk to the researcher, we get the legal agreement for, let's say, a sponsored research agreement. The sponsored research agreement would get an additional agreement from our side stating that all the future ownership of maybe a rising IP or a rising data goes to the one who's owning it on chain. We package that and have that in our contract. We talk to the specific DAO that might be interested in funding it, and the funds find its way to the researcher. We mint the IP-NFT, transferring the ownership to the DAO, and therefore making this asset transferable also from the DAO to other people if they want to, and add certain components, for example, data storage components that we want to facilitate, for example, when the data flows in from the researcher and the DAO wants to look at those data points. Okay. Now let's have a quick look at what are further things that the IP-NFT could enable that we're let's say a little bit brainstorming or cooking up right now already in the background. Now, already mentioned here the part of the IP-NFT being basically a tool that the DAO is enabling the DAO to manage and govern that asset. But what does it actually mean? Let's say the researcher actually found some interesting data points and around a certain molecule, and they now want to foster the research around this. They can move it along the life cycle by the DAO deciding to actually invest more into that research, get either the same researcher or a different researcher or maybe even a biotech to form to bring that further in the life cycle. Because they're together can vote on this, can govern it, they're actually in a great position to do this, and at some point maybe even spin it out or sell it to someone who can bring it onto the market, or even find the funds to do that themselves. But this is obviously more like future, the ideas for the future of this framework, because right now the first IP-NFT has just been minted last year, so we need to see how well they actually perform. But this is what we envision here, how this can actually foster a potential future pharma company, and the DAO actually, helping bring that into fruition. Now, on the other side, the IP-NFT enables you actually to access the DeFi Legos. Now, what are DeFi Legos? It's basically a set of tools that people are brewing up in the decentralized finance ecosystem that allow you to use those assets that you have on chain to permissionless get, for example, borrowing and lending based on that. So you could do asset-based lending. Somebody would obviously need to find a way to evaluate the value of that certain asset, but you could, for example, start integrating it with lending protocols, and then get funds for further research projects or needs that you have. Now, another aspect is actually fractionalization of this IP-NFT. Let's say several different DAOs want to work together on something, or different people want to work together on this IP-NFT. We've already been working with our legal advisors on frameworks to fractionalize the IP-NFT so that several people can actually have ownership. That creates a little bit of complexity, obviously, when you have different modules included in the IP-NFT, such as data storage modules. But it is a promising way to actually de-risk the exposure for one specific research project and enable people themselves, and maybe even like investment funds, to have a basket of IP-NFTs. So, for example, I want to personally, with a couple of friends, form a fund, and we want to invest in like a basket of interesting research projects in the longevity space. The fractionalization of that would enable me to do that. All right. This is basically a quick overview of the framework and the long-term upsides that we see there. We're super interested to get in touch with people who A, are interested in using it, B, have ideas how we can improve it. Obviously, this is currently in an MVP fashion. We've been iterating on it. We're now already having it running in production, but we're trying to improve it with a V2, with a V3 whenever we can. So if you have feedback, thoughts, we'd love to hear those. And lastly, thank you for listening to this and giving your attention. And if you are interested in learning more, come to molecule.to, and you will also find the link on our website. Join us in our Discord server, and we're happy to answer all the questions there and loop you in, for example, in certain projects that we're working on if you want to stay in touch.